Good morning, Mr. Chair, and good morning to my colleagues. This is a very important moment, a very serious moment, and a moment of reasoned bipartisanship to fight the scourge of fentanyl. Let me, as I begin, take this opportunity at the outset to express my condolences, Mrs. Rockwell, for the tragic loss of your son, Logan. Thank you for your courage of being here. It is not easy for a mother to speak of the loss of her son. It's not the same thing, but I spent time with the mothers in Uvalde, and it is simply painful. And so your presence here today is a stark reminder, as I said as I walked into this room, that we must be determined to fight the scourge of fentanyl. And we must break the cycle as well of drug addiction, and we must stop the loss of life from this deadly and terrible plague. Thank you for your presence here today. But we must also, as we go forward in this illicit fentanyl, work with our families, work with the nation on drug demands fueled by addiction. We must require the federal government to acknowledge the lessons that they have previously learned, and they must embrace and work bipartisan and include and embrace inclusive strategies that involve aggressive interdiction and community-based treatment. We should not leave families alone. They must have our support. The unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic contributed to the rise in fentanyl-related overdoses beginning in 2019 as treatment, recovery, and prevention services were interrupted and schools, jobs, and mental health support faltered, especially for those suffering from substance abuse disorders. While the previous administration was focused on China building a wall on the southern border, fentanyl came in through the front door and exploded in this country. It is recognizable that China has a major involvement in fentanyl communicating with Mexico. That is, of course, a response that we have to deal with as it relates to that interaction. In 2021, fentanyl was linked to more than 1,600 fatal overdoses in Texas, with African Americans becoming the face of a second national wave of fentanyl-related overdoses. Around the country, many faces were the faces of fentanyl overdoses. Newly released data shows a heightened rate of overdoses in our minority communities, especially among seniors, disproportionately affected by fentanyl addiction, despite an overall decline of overdose rates. Far from the inaction, as the hearing title implies, the Biden administration and Congress have both taken decisive steps to address the scourge of fentanyl. To disrupt the supply chain of fentanyl, Democrats passed the fiscal year 2023 omnibus spending package, which included $60 million to hire 125 additional CBP officers and support personnel at ports of entry, and $70 million to strengthen non-intrusive inspection systems to scan vehicles. I've just come back from the border and talking to our very fine officers. They are working without ceasing. They are going more than the extra mile. We need to give them the resources. They need to be the Superman, Batman, and Mighty Man at the border to be able to assure that fentanyl has a stop sign before it comes into this country. This investment in interdiction resources is critical because the fentanyl supply chain crosses an ocean and several international borders, as I have said. China and increasingly India export most of the chemical precursors to Mexico that are used in the early stages of fentanyl production, where Mexican cartels produce illicit fentanyl products for smuggling to the United States. That is why the Biden administration is working with the Mexican government through several initiatives and redoubling diplomatic efforts to engage China to interrupt the deadly supply chain. Contrary to some expressed opinion, the Mexican cartels primarily use U.S. citizens to drive vehicles and trucks filled with hard-to-detect packages of synthesized fentanyl through lawful ports of entry, while couriers carry and send packages through the U.S. mail and private carriers. We've got to stomp that out. There is one major danger posed by the illicit supply of fentanyl that is particularly troubling: the production of fake or counterfeit pills, which have been found in every state and hold an often deadly secret. It has to be a collective effort. Last year, DEA agents said 4 out of every 10 pills on Houston streets were laced with fentanyl, leading users, including teenagers, to die without knowing what they took. That is why I intend to introduce a bill that will provide grant funding for teachers and other schools to have the necessary adverse drugs that help in other overdose reversal drugs on hand and receive training to administer them properly. My bill will also provide enhanced penalties that do not include mandatory minimums for online sellers and manufacturers of fake pills if death or serious bodily injury occurs. To educate the public, particularly young people and their parents, the Biden administration launched a One Pill Can Kill public awareness campaign to raise awareness of the dangers of fake prescription pills laced with fentanyl. Because the cartels mass-produce fake pills to resemble other Schedule II prescription opioids, such as Oxycontin and Percocet, depressants such as Xanax or stimulants like Adderall, even casual users of illegal drugs can be drawn into the web of the fentanyl trade with deadly consequences. The hard truth is that we can only temporarily disrupt supply of illicit fentanyl temporarily before another cartel, trafficking method, or analog moves in to take over the market that addiction creates. There is scientific basis to this. We're well aware of this chain of events. We can disrupt the flow, but we must also reduce the demand. Far too long, our country has chosen the wrong approach in fighting drug abuse alone. We've left parents and families, communities alone. Criminalizing addiction when people need treatment is a difficult and challenging pathway, and it impacts all of our communities, young and communities of color. That is why in the last Congress we passed the Rural Opioid Abuse Prevention Act, which several Republicans who sit on this very subcommittee voted against. That legislation provided funding to rural communities to combat the fentanyl crisis that they were facing, in addition to $104 million in grants and assistance the Biden administration allocated to the Rural Communities Opioid Response Program. I can assure you, those rural communities welcomed this help that they had not gotten before. It is important to stress that we must not make the same mistakes of fentanyl-related substances, or the synthetic opioids that we have seen happen before and have not gotten the job done. We've got to get the job done. We cannot have mothers coming to tell us the story of their beloved and beautiful child. As we learned through the crack epidemic of the 1980s, followed by amphetamine, the 1990s, and prescription drugs, and back to heroin once again, we cannot incarcerate our way out of this, out of the scourge of fentanyl and synthetic opioids. I'm concerned that banning the entire class of fentanyl-related substances without safeguards significantly may impact what we have to do in research and finding a way to stop this addiction. I also remain opposed to the expansion of mandatory minimums, penalties that prevent judges from considering the unique facts and circumstances of that addicted person who comes before them. According to most recent statistics from the U.S. Sentencing Commission, there are already significant racial disparities in the prosecution of fentanyl trafficking cases, people of color comprising more than 78% of those sentenced in 2021. The same is true for federal convictions involving fentanyl analogs, which 86% of those people were people of color. We must also be reminded that people who are young are the victims, and we must save them because they must have a future. Of those prosecuted for fentanyl trafficking, less than 5% received a guideline increase for a leadership or supervisory role, and less than 10% of those prosecuted for fentanyl analog trafficking received a leadership or supervisory increase. There is no doubt that we're currently experiencing a crisis, but it is a crisis that Congress and the Biden administration have responded to with urgency and clear eyes, and I would certainly like to emphasize that we should do so on this committee. Just a statistic, in the past year, CBP seized over 260,000 pounds of illicit drugs at the border, including more than 13,000 pounds of fentanyl. In December 2022, as we passed the fiscal year, as I reported, we did $60 million, and we reported another $70 million to strengthen non-intrusive inspection systems that scan vehicles and cargo to disrupt the flow of drugs. We are working intensely. And of course, it shows that Customs and Border Protection data shows that since fiscal 2020, more than 90% of fentanyl, heroin, and methamphetamine seizures occurred at U.S. ports of entry, with almost 97% of all fentanyl seizures happening at ports of entry this fiscal year. We are working to stop the death. And in 2021, U.S. citizens accounted for 86.3% of fentanyl trafficking convictions, compared to just 8.9% of undocumented migrants. Let's get the facts to save lives. Therefore, let's work together. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I hope to have an earnest discussion about solutions to reduce the supply of fentanyl and combat and prevent addiction and overdoses. We must save lives.